I work as a CNA in a nursing home. Now, this particular nursing home used to be a boarding school for students of all ages. Sadly, the school burned down, and I'm not too sure of how many died in there, but what I do know is that our residents still talk about a little boy and a little girl. One night, I worked from 11 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. I did my first rounds and went to change this resident. She was mumbling to herself, so I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that this little girl keeps crawling around in her room. I told her no, there's no little girl crawling around in your room, and it's okay to go to sleep and get some rest. Then I left. It was about 1:30 a.m., and my coworkers and I were in the break room chit-chatting when all of a sudden we heard a scream come from the same room that the resident was telling me about the little girl. I ran in there to see what was going on, and our blankets and pillows were all over the floor and messed up. She kept screaming, "Get off me, you little brat." And I was thinking to myself, what the heck? I asked her what was wrong and why were all the blankets on the floor. She said that this little girl wouldn't get off of her. At this point, I was like, screw this. I grabbed all her blankets and pillows and tucked her in and just left. Another time, when I was working the night shift again, one of the residents wanted to use the restroom, so I brought him to the machine. I left him there for a couple of minutes and told him to call me when he's finished. He then called me and I went in and checked. He said to me, "Why are all these kids so loud?" And I asked, "What kids?" "There's no kids around here." And he said, "Well, when you were here, they were here too, but when you left, they also left too." I quickly got him out of the bathroom and into his bed and just left. Working at a nursing home makes me realize that there is still life after death, no matter if it's the elderly that died there or what used to be the place of a building before. This story is about my younger sister's encounter in 2006. It is not made up in any way or form. However, I will use first person instead of third person to tell the story. Names have been changed to protect the identities of the people. We live in the boonies of North Carolina. To get to our house, you would have to drive down a paved road surrounded by woods. Halfway down the road, the pavement stops and you continue down a gravel road. So down this neck of the woods is my house and two other homes, that of which belonged to my cousins, Lou and Joe. We were still middle schoolers at this time and caught the bus every morning at 6:55. It was October and daylight saving had already began. It was dark by 5 p.m. and stayed dark until nearly 8 a.m. As the old folks like to put it, when the days are shorter and the nights are longer. My house is behind my cousin Lou's trailer, so to get to the bus stop, I passed his trailer. It's a good 3 to 4 minutes to the main road where the bus picks us up. My cousin Lou and I would usually walk together up the gravel road to the paved road where we would join Joe to wait for the bus at the top of the road. For the past few days, my cousin Lou had his mom take him to school so he could sleep in. So I walked to the bus stop on my own. No big deal. I lived there for nearly all my life and knew all the whereabouts of this place. There was nothing to fear, or so I thought. I woke up on this October morning and did my usual routine. Got dressed and put my jacket on, grabbed my book bag and headed out. I walked down from my house toward Lou's house. He had told me the day before that he would not be catching the bus for the next few days or so I did not expect him to be waiting on this morning. I walked down the road of my house, and as soon as I got closer to Lou's house, I see a dark form of a person standing by the stairs of Lou's trailer. Odd, I thought to myself. Lou said he wouldn't be taking the bus. I slowed down, and as I got closer to his house, the form looked at me. It was too dark to see the face, but I knew its eyes were piercing me, and as I got closer, the form seemed to be that of a woman. I knew then that it wasn't Lou, This woman-like figure did not move. She just stood there and stared at me as I walked by. The hair on my skin stood up and I thought to myself, forget this, I'm not going to call out to it. I kept walking up the gravel and paved road until I reached the top and joined Joe. For the rest of the day, I thought nothing of it. I had convinced myself that my lack of sleep had caused me to become delusional. The next morning, I woke up, did my routine as I did the day before. As I walked out the door of my house, I felt strange and uneasy but shook it off. Again, I knew Thu would not be taking the bus. As I walked closer to his house, I see the same woman-like figure standing by the stairs as if she had been waiting. As was the previous encounter, it was too dark for me to make the face of this thing, and I walked past it as fast as my legs could carry me. Maisie. A voice called out my name in slow motion, and it sounded like it was right behind me. I turned around and that thing was gone. WTF was the only thought at the moment, and I walked faster and faster down the road. By this time, all the hairs on my body had stood up and my legs felt like jello. I walked up the road and felt a sudden urge to look behind me. To my fear, I almost had a heart attack as I saw that thing walking a few yards behind me. I walked faster and faster and tried to think happy thoughts. It felt like all the gravity was pulling me down and my legs were getting heavier and heavier. In due time, I finally reached the bus stop. Unfortunately for me, on this day, Joe was nowhere to be found. I was all alone and scared, but I needed to know if that thing was still following me. Gathering all my courage, I turned around and there she was, still walking up the road towards me in a hunch-over posture. The sky was getting brighter, still dark, but enough for me to see that she had long dark hair that covered most of her pale face. My heart felt as if it would jump right out of my chest. It was coming closer and closer and closer. I was about to burst into tears as I see Joe walking up the road towards me. At this instant, the woman jumps into the woods and was gone before I could blink. I had never felt so much relief to see Joe. Later on that day, I told my sisters and my mom about what happened. My grandparents tied a red string on my hand and said a chant while doing so. Ever since, I have not encountered that thing. There was no explanation of who that woman or thing was, and I did not want to find out why it followed me. To this day, thinking about it still scares me deeply. I used to live in this small city in Colorado with my husband and 3 kids. My sister and her daughter needed a place, so we looked around for rental units. She was also 3 to 4 months pregnant with her ex's baby at this time. Everywhere was too expensive and she couldn't afford it. Finally, we found a small 2-bedroom duplex that was cheap and only a few blocks from where I lived. She gets off work late, so we couldn't go to see the place until it was getting dark. Unlike other duplexes, where the 2 units are usually side by side, facing the street, the units on this duplex was adjoined with the front doors facing the neighbor's house. The available unit had windows facing the back alley, and the occupied unit faced the street. As soon as we got there, we met the management agent that was showing the property. We walked inside, and immediately I had this weird feeling. I brushed it off as nerves. The unit was dark, and the management lady mentioned something about the electricity not on, so there was hardly any light. We walked from the door into the living room and to the dining room. As I stood in the dining room, I thought this was an odd and creepy room. I felt cold. I never mentioned anything to my sister. Without having seen much of the place because it was dark, she signed a 1-year lease the next day. She didn't want to miss this opportunity because it was cheap, close to me, and she would finally have her own place. She was only 19. She moved in and lived there without any incidents for a few months. However, she mentioned that she had been having nightmares ever since she moved in. I told her it was probably nothing. I slept over with my kids a few times, and I always had nightmares there as well, but didn't think anything of it. Then, one day, my husband and I had an argument, and I decided I would spend the night at her place to calm down. While I was there, she left with her then ex for the night. I stayed there all by myself, talking on the phone with my husband and trying to make up. I got cold and went to heat my feet on the heater vents in the dining room. As I sat down on the ground, I saw a girl on all fours with really long and messy hair in the corner of the dining room. She looked like she was convulsing and gnawing on something. I was scared, but so shocked by this and didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run. Then she disappeared. I thought I must have gone crazy, so I never mentioned this incident to anyone, not even my husband. Then, one night, my husband and I decided to leave our kids with my sister so we could have a night out. On our way back, my sister called me on my phone and told me that my 1.5-year-old daughter, who could only speak a few words, was freaking her out. I asked her why, and she told me, "Your daughter was playing, and all of a sudden she started screaming and crying and saying that she was scared. I asked her if the other kids scared her, but she shook her head no. I questioned all the kids who had just scared her, and they said no one was near her and that no one had scared her. She just kept pointing to the corner of the room, crying and saying scare, scare. She wouldn't go near there and kept crying." At this point, I was also freaked out. Before she could tell me where my daughter was pointing at, I said, "Let me guess. It's the corner of the wall with the windows that meet the kitchen, huh?" She looked puzzled and asked, "How'd you know?" I told her I will tell her when I get there, since I didn't want her to be scared. I eventually told her what I experienced at her house. She was so scared she barely went home from then on. Then, while living there, her and her boyfriend kept getting sleep paralysis and sat on. She would have really vivid dreams of a child coming to play with her. She would tell the child that she is tired and does not want to play. The child then tried to get her to get up by poking a long fingernail in her eye. The next day, the eye that this ghost child had been poking was all red and infected. Then, the same thing happened again a week later, and again, her eye became red and infected. This time, the child told her, "If you do not play with me, I will wait until your baby comes, and I will play with your baby." Not knowing what to do, we told my mom what had been happening. She got mad and said my sister should have never rented that place. It was positioned weird with the entrance to the basement from the outside, and that was a bad sign. So she went to the place with my sister and said out loud, "Whoever you are not welcomed here. You have passed and this is no longer your home. You must move on. This is our home now." The day she did that, I took a nap on my sofa and had a vivid dream that these men, 3 to 4 of them, were looking for me. They were Caucasian and dressed like they were from a different time period. They walked right into my house and told me, as I was still lying on the sofa, that they were not leaving and the home belongs to them. They walked out and left. I told my mom, and my mom advised my sister to move out since the spirits refused to leave and my sister didn't want to do the jingle bell ritual stuff. She did eventually move before her lease ran out. I tried to research the home but found nothing. The only thing I found was that her house was one of the very first built for the miners who used to live there. The miners back in the day would ride the train, which is still in use now next to your house, to get to work. From my dreams and experiences, I do believe that there is more than one spirit there. Perhaps being so close to the train track has made her home a portal and crossroad for these things. The neighbor that lived in the other duplex mentioned unexplainable phenomenons that had been happening to her too. That neighbor then moved out right after my sister moved. My former neighbor's name is Ashley. 2 years ago, on her birthday, she made a wish that she and her boyfriend would be together forever. It was also the day that he proposed to her. So on that special day, he put a ring on her finger and said their vows and did a mini wedding right there in her apartment. I was also there to celebrate her birthday, and they asked me to be their witness. And long story short, I was their witness. Then, out of curiosity, they asked me how Hmong people made lover promises, and I told them about the blood oath. You know, the one where you prick each other's finger and drink each other's blood. Of course, they laughed, and I understood why, because first of all, it isn't very hygienic and safe to do. Come on, drinking other people's blood. Most of you wouldn't even share the same soda pop with someone else. But they were open-minded, and they took it very seriously. And long story short, I told them not to do it. Then they got married. But soon, Ashley's boyfriend lost his job and they were going through a hard time. He started to drink and the marriage started to fall apart. Then, one day, Ashley suddenly came over to my place and asked me if the blood oath thing was real. I told her that I didn't know, but according to Hmong people, yes, it is real. And she left. Long story short, Ashley and her husband went through some marriage counseling and things were getting better between them. Her husband then found another job and their life returned to the lolly-dolly fairy tale that it used to be. I felt very happy for them. But life isn't fair, because one day, life is great and the next day, her husband died of a sudden heart attack. A month after the death of her husband, Ashley came back to my apartment and asked me if the blood oath thing was really true. And again, I told her the same thing. But this time I wondered if they did it. And unfortunately, she said that it was silly, but yes, they drank each other's blood. And just to be nice, I said, "Oh, you probably shouldn't have done that." But in my mind, I was really like, "Gosh, you're so dumb." Apparently, she wanted to do anything she could to save their marriage, and one day they decided to give the Hmong blood oath a try. And surprisingly, it worked in saving their marriage. At least that's what she claimed, because it brought them closer together and reminded them of how much they loved each other. But she said that strange things have been happening ever since the death of her husband. The TV turns on its own, and sometimes plates would be broken. Sometimes she gets home and it looks like someone has been going through her clothes, and the strangest thing is that at night, it sounds like someone is walking in her living room. I gotta admit, I got super creeped out when I heard this and said to her, "I advise you to sleep at the church for a while." But she said that it wasn't necessary because she's just a bit stressed out. But I took it seriously, and the very next day, I started hanging up joss paper everywhere in my apartment. She came over and asked what I was doing, and I said that I was decorating. And she said it looks very pretty, and I said, "Thank you." But in my mind, I was like, "Get out of my house." Ashley started looking worse and worse every day, and her stories became scarier and scarier. For example, she said that one night she suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and saw an arm reaching out from her closet. I tried my best to help her, but there was nothing I could do. So after a month, the lease on my apartment expired and my roommate and I had to move out. I'm not sure how Ashley is doing these days, but before we moved out, she told us that her doctor had diagnosed her with depression and mild schizophrenia. We don't believe that ghosts are real, was what her doctor said to her, and he gave her some antidepressant pills. It didn't look like the medication was working for her, so I guess these days Ashley would either be 1. Doing great, 2. In a mental institution somewhere, 3. In her apartment still being haunted, or 4. Dead. So if it is either choice 3 or 4 and you happen to live in the apartment next to Ashley, please say hi when you see her. She would be of 29 years old right now, with curly blonde hair, tall and skinny, and she likes to smile a lot, even during those times when she was haunted. Good luck. Jesus Christ, the writer of this post sounds like a horrible person. True story. In Seattle, Washington. I have 2 older sisters, Shua and Zhang. Before I was born, when they were about the age of 10 and 11, my aunt, who was about 13 at the time, invited them to play the Ouija board. So, my aunt, Zhang, and Shua, and my cousin Julie, who was 12, and Shua's best friend from school, Mandy, all came over to our house to play the Ouija board. Of course, my sisters knew that my aunt was just trying to scare them at first. After a while, the game got boring, until the pointer moved to the word hello by itself. My sister, Joa, being the youngest of them and the most curious, said, "Who's there?" At this point, they all had their hands on the pointer. The pointer shifted to the words R-I-C-K-Y. Ricky. "Are you friendly?" said my aunt. The pointer shifted to the left corner where it said yes. They all continued to speak to Ricky, and he would always answer them. Almost every day after school, the group would come over to play the board at my house and continued to speak to Ricky. My sister Joa told me that she remembered he was really funny. One time, when it was just her and her friend Mandy playing, they were both starting to get bored. So Mandy picked up a book in one hand and had her hand on the pointer. Suddenly, the pointer started to move in a circle around the board, making Joa and Mandy move in a circular motion over and over again. So Joa asked, "What are you doing, Ricky?" The pointer then moved to the words that spelled out, "I'm dancing." The next day, the whole group was over again and played the board as usual. This time, Ricky spoke to them without them having to ask him a question. The words spelled out, "Girls, be careful. Stay away from boys." All the girls had no clue what he was trying to say. They tried to continue communicating with him, but he just wouldn't respond. So everyone just went home. 1 week later, my cousin Julie was attacked by her ex-boyfriend and he tried to assault her, but she escaped and called 911. Ever since then, my sister Joa has been trying to contact Ricky, but he has never replied back. And as the girls grew older into their teens, the less the Ouija board would work. It has been 17 years since then, and my older sisters tell me the story all the time, trying to convince me that there's actually good things that can come out of playing the Ouija board. To this day, my sister still tries to contact Ricky on her Ouija board. I had just moved out of my home and into a new place for the first time. It wasn't too far from my mom and dad. It was about 30 minutes, but I was glad to be on my own. When I first toured the house, I was so excited that everything looked brand new with the smell of fresh paint and soap-washed carpet. It went to my head, so I didn't notice anything else until I moved in and realized how old the place actually was. Sure, the kitchen and bathroom was updated, but the style of the house told of its age, which had to at least be 50 years old. It was a small house with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. The living room and kitchen was separated by a counter. I really liked that there was a big window that looked out to the front yard, even though there was a big oak tree blocking half the view. My first night there, I had just fixed a microwave dinner plate and sat down on a beanbag on the living room floor. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. Looking at my wristwatch, it wasn't that late, but already dark out. I didn't have a peephole, but a chain guard bolted to the door, so I turned on the porch light and eased the door open about 2 inches to see who it was. It was a new neighborhood, and I didn't know anyone yet. There was no one there at all, nor were there anyone on the street, which was odd since it was barely after dark. You would figure 1 or 2 people would be taking their pets out or something. A cold breeze touched my face and I froze. I thought I heard someone whisper and I shut the door quickly. It was a humid summer night, so that breeze was out of place. I told myself it was nothing and tried to shake it off. I couldn't eat my dinner while I was watching TV, and after an hour or two, I decided to go take a shower and head to bed. Suddenly, the house seemed so big, almost too big that I felt a shiver of anticipation. I don't know why I'd like to turn the lights off when I watch the television, but I do, and right now the television was muted. I looked around me, left, right, and left again toward the big window. The blinds were drawn up, and I could almost swear I had put them down before turning off the lights to watch television as I was paranoid of peeping Toms. I don't know why, but I felt dread in every part of me when I stood up from my beanbag chair. The window was about 12 feet from where I was sitting, and when I walked closer and closer to it, I could see my reflection with the light from the television. I stared at my reflection and was about to reach for the strings that brought down the blinds when something caught my eyes. There was something a few feet behind me in the window reflection. I started shaking when I realized it was a supernatural being. In fear, my body wouldn't move to my command. It was terrifying that I couldn't even remove my stare that its image has engraved itself in my brain. It was a woman. I could tell by her long hair and dark gown. I could only see so much since the only light source was the television. Her hair looked like it was being blown by fierce winds, even though there were none in the house. I stared at her face, which was in the shadows, and saw her start to smile, a menacing open-mouthed grin with sharp teeth. She was covered in blood. I knew it was blood because I could smell it. Someone had cut her face from the edge of her lips to her ears. It looked like her jaw was about to unhinge itself, and all of a sudden, her tongue seemed to roll off her mouth and hung almost to the floor. I heard her rasp through her mouth like she was trying to say something, but the blood gargled her voice. Suddenly, the television shut off and it was completely dark except for the dimness of the streetlights coming through my window. At that moment, I almost peed myself. I couldn't see her anymore, but I heard and smelled her. I was suddenly able to move and started crying out of relief and fear, but could tell she was coming for me, so I ran towards the direction of the door. I encountered the wall and moved along it in search of freedom, sobbing at the unfairness of life. It felt like hours before I found the door and unlocked it. Flinging it wide, I grabbed the side of the frame at the same time. I felt an icy hand grasp my wrist and shoved myself outside. I ran without looking behind me to my neighbor's house and knocked on their door, but no one answered, so I kept going to the next and the next. No one opened their doors. The next thing I knew, someone was waking me up. It was a policeman asking me if I was okay. I jerked awake. With wide eyes, I realized it was daylight and I was outside. Apparently, I had passed out on someone's lawn last night. I started to cry and told my story to the cop, then asking him why no one would help me. He turned pale at my story and told me that I didn't have any neighbors because no one lived on the street and that there hadn't been anyone living here for years after a brutal murder of several young women, each of them slashed in the face. The person who committed these crimes also disappeared too. The officer thought that I might have been the last victim when he saw me during a routine drive. I begged him to escort me to my car and drove away from this place.